Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual member screening of Some Kind of Heaven. I'm Sam Flancher. I'm a programmer at the film festival, and we are thrilled to be joined by Lance Oppenheim, the director of this film. Lance, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I love this festival, and I appreciate you guys programming it. It's an honor to be with you.
Yeah, and so we actually have an audience question to start things off, just sort of to get us going. This is a question from, let me find her name. Teresa is wondering what inspired you to make the film. So, and I'm just curious also about like just the beginnings, how you found the place, sort of what space that place occupied in your brain before you decided to make a film about the villages.
Yeah, so I'm from Florida. I grew up having heard about the villages quite a bit, but never really had the desire to make a film about it. I had heard about it as this kind of like hedonistic playground paradise place where, growing up, there was this rumor of like, I think there was of the villages having one of the highest rates of STDs. And I think as like a middle schooler, I was like, holy shit, that's crazy. But that wasn't like a motivational thing that made me be like, oh man, I gotta go and find out what this is. It was only until like far later, I had just made a film about a man living on a cruise ship who was a retiree who exclusively lived on Royal Caribbean cruise ships for 20 years. And he, had a kind of interesting outlook on escapism and escapism as an everyday form of life. And after finishing that film, I had seen some statistic that the villages had become one of the fastest growing cities in America, and that 120,000 people from across the country were all kind of, deciding to, leave behind the lives they led, leave their families behind as well, and kind of move into this, Truman Show-like community that more or less was designed to simulate the American yesteryear or scenes from their youth. So I started off, I was looking at images, obviously the sex stuff I remembered from my childhood, but I was less interested in the fact that like people have sex. I mean, if anything, I was like, it's great. I'm glad people do it. And especially at that age, I would hope to do so as well. But it was really more of the decision, I think, of looking at, the ways in which not only that generation, but just a kind of this American desire, also maybe like a deeply Floridian desire to escape from something and kind of, exploring the consequences of what it's like to live a lifestyle like that. And I also kind of, I think it's a very relatable pursuit as well to try and leave behind all the negative news and block out all the things in life that seem unpleasant. But I thought it was interesting that there were so many people that were choosing to spend their last few, the last chapter of their lives basically inside of a place like that. So that was the impulse to go and initially make something about the place. I had no idea it would become a feature-length film. This was initially this project started off as my college thesis. So things kind of evolved from there. And then I just slowly tried to clean up the mess I had made after I, fell into finding these kind of spectacular people who let me into their lives.
It's funny you mentioned this like Floridian specifically desire. I find that filmmakers from Florida, it's almost like without it being like an aesthetic tradition, there's like a pride or like a fascination I feel for artists, like about the state itself and the place for people who grow up there. And this sort of falls in line with that like Floridian examination of whatever the hell is going on down there.
Yeah, I mean, it's like everyone's favorite, sinking state. It's like the most bipolar place ever. It's like, went red, but also voted for, minimum wage, or sorry, for the minimum wage to increase. It's like there's a lot of stuff going on here, and the state is like bisected in half. It's completely different in South Florida as it is in Central Florida as it is in Northern Florida. So there's a lot of, I think, I was grateful. I don't think I understood how grateful I was to grow up here because, as a documentarian and as someone who was just trying to kind of figure out what kind of films I was trying to make, it was an amazing place to kind of cut my teeth on finding like bizarre stories. I think I don't know if it's that the state or just there are different pockets of the state that attract people to move here and kind of I don't know if it's a form of escapism or something else, but I definitely think like the climate, the amount of time one can spend in, you know, the like the seasons that are not the winter, you know, every other season here is so brutal. Something must happen in people's brain chemistry, and mine as well, probably, that has you know, made me want to make movies, not just in Florida, but I feel like about themes and things that I was experiencing and thinking about when I was growing up here. But I certainly didn't enjoy growing up here. So I think like, it was only when I left that I started realizing how, you know, how much I, in some ways, kind of missed it. And I think a lot of the cinematic potential and the unexplored cinematic potential of the state, I think it's only been really, I think like Kelly Reichardt, with her debut feature was like, that was the first time I feel like in independent filmmaking, there was a real, like, I don't know, there was like this upsurge. Everyone was kind of like, oh my God, there's a very particular kind of movie you can make here. And obviously you have great filmmakers that have kind of Harmony Korine moving in. You have Zola this past year, Janixa Bravo's film. You have a lot of great films that have that I feel like are drenched. Obviously Michael Mann's movies, that are drenched in something that is more chemical and you know, experiential or something than that is distinctly Florida, I think.
Yeah, some kind of like American Floridian mystique. It's a very rich sort of material to draw from, it seems like. I want to ask more about sort of your initial encounters with the villages and sort of being there initially, what you thought. So you arrive there, you maybe start thinking about making a project there. What were the initial, like, what were you thinking as you were wandering around and watching the people?
I mean, so you know, I despite growing up around, like, you know, seemingly like hundreds of retirement communities, that I didn't know anyone in the villages, and my grandparents didn't know anyone. You know, the way I kind of got in, I just looked, literally just was like, oh, maybe they have Airbnbs or something there, and I like went on Airbnb, and surely enough, I found that they did. So I kind of immediately was like, okay, maybe I should try and like use this not only as an opportunity to find like a place to stay, but also as like a way to actually meet someone. And who can I find that is the most interesting looking host? And surely enough, I found these two retired rodeo clowns. I moved in with them for about probably like 4 or 5 weeks, maybe a little bit less than that. But I kind of moved in there without a camera at first, just so I could kind of get a sense of, you know, what the place was like. They showed me around. They kind of, you know, gave me this, like, handed me this like 250 page club listing document that had like every club on there, from like the Elaine's to like the cheerleaders to the Zumba club to like 50 different versions of Bingo Club. And then I just kind of started showing up to things. I started, you know, sometimes I would send emails, sometimes I would just show up unsolicited. And I just kind of got myself invited, and I just kind of, you know, every time I would go, I would sort of explain that I was there. I was an outsider. I was much younger than everybody. Obviously, all this was implicit. They could notice it for themselves. And I had no idea what I was really making or doing, you know, being there. I had no right being there, but I was there I was curious, and I wanted to get to know people and get to hear their stories. But, you know, I think like the focus with any, like, I feel like with any movie, with most documentaries, I imagine the focus changes. I think if you're making a documentary and you know exactly what you're going to do, and then you come out of it making the exact film you set out to, I don't know how interesting those films normally kind of are. You have to be open. You have to be curious. I think when I first got there, I was like thinking about a lot of the institutions of the place. I think my brain was going to probably a lot of the places that I think, you know, I had a lot of journalists' brains would go to. I wanted to make maybe at first like something more along the lines of like a Fred Wiseman movie that could kind of look at some of the, you know, the newspaper that only prints the good news, and the radio station that only plays the hits from the, you know, 50s and 60s. And
right.
I think, you know, by both like not really getting the access I needed, but also I think my interests ultimately kind of started to change. I realized that was the more obvious movie one could make. And I started kind of thinking more existentially about like, you know, what the experience is like to be there when, you know, essentially everyone who was living there was kind of trying to get back to this time that I was currently in, like college. And in college, I had a great time, but there was plenty of times I also felt like I was trying to belong to something I didn't really know too much about, or I didn't exist in something. I felt like, all the feelings I was feeling in college, what if like those were not only like blown up, but like those were the feelings I had to be stuck with like in the last 10 years or 20 years of living. So I started thinking about those things, and I started meeting people that kind of, in some ways affirmed that kind of thought. And, the film changed, but I would definitely be, I would be lying if I told you I knew exactly what I was doing. And I would also be lying if I told you that, I think like when I first got there, I think you can kind of notice this in the filmmaking as well. Like the beginning of the film, you have a lot more of the shots that kind of are more distanced. You have this kind of like there's a distancing effect that it's a little bit more cooler before you get to, or more cool before you get to the subjects. It's something that is more, I don't know, kind of like walking the tightrope act between being judgmental and being curious. And I think over time, that was really when I first got there, I felt like I was walking in alien territory. I didn't understand anything. I thought it was like a complete, total fantasy land fairy tale that was also like completely deranged. And then when I finally started to get to know people, and I started to kind of hang around folks more and get to know their stories, obviously, especially the main subjects of the film, my perspective changed. And I think the way we were photographing the world there, and my approach to thinking about how to kind of frame these stories became a lot closer and more intimate. And I think that, the more time we spent, the more I was attempting to kind of, I don't know, not do an expose of the place, but really kind of show, how like real people going through real problems in an unreal place, kind of showing how there is an authenticity that obviously happens there, that kind of can change the view of, almost like expose even more how prefab and how kind of plastic everything could feel. And if you could make the plastic feel real, that was sort of like, that was sort of the goal, was how do you take something that overtly looks plastic when the movie starts, and by the end of it, you still know it's plastic, but you know that there's a reason why people exist there, and there's a reason that it works. And I think it may be depressing to some people, it may be hopeful to others, but like that I think ultimately became what the guiding kind of vision for the film turned out to be.
Yeah, I think one of my this like blend of reality and or unreality or surreality. One of my favorite moments, maybe my favorite in the film, is the sort of mention that there are no gates. The woman who's like checking people in at the car, it's like these are public roads. She's just
Yeah.
kind of like saying hello to everyone. It's just this like subtle slipping in from public life to this other kind of sort of, not deranged isn't the word, but this different sort of grasping maybe public private life, or yeah, I don't know.
No, totally. Yeah, no, I mean, I like the symbolic kind of aspects of like security there, and I think a lot of things there, when you look at it at first, like when you first pull up to the villages and you see the gates, you think something completely different when you start to exist around there a little longer. And you know, I don't know, not to sound pretentious or something. There was like I remember reading this Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville. Is that the name? I don't want to butcher it right now. This would be embarrassing. But I remember I remember reading about when he first came to America. He noticed, I think he stumbled across a sect of New York, and he had seen a building from afar that looked like it was made out of brick or something like that. And as he got closer to it and he finally approached it, he realized that it was like completely a facade. Like everything, it was like the structure of it was like really tacky, really cheap. Like immediately when he first stepped, like minutes upon getting to America, he realized that like nothing was how it appeared to be. And I feel like the same. I mean, I feel like the brilliance and the design of the villages. I mean, obviously it works so well, and I think it's cheaply constructed. But obviously, they spend a fortune just basically upkeeping the place and manicuring it and everything. Now not that like the film, I mean, I guess the film by conventional standards was probably cheaper to make than other documentaries, but like that same idea, we wanted to kind of approach the filmmaking in a similar way. We wanted to kind of use the setting of the place, like riff off of the reality of the place, and make it feel, both from a stylistic approach, but even just like how we actually shot the movie and how we collaborate with our subjects. We wanted the kind of like reality blurring effects, the dreaminess of the place to kind of enter the filmmaking, and all of the compositions of the film, the way it's shot, needed to feel as intentional and as manicured in a way as the place did. So there was a lot of thinking about like, how do we take the thematic ideas of the gate greeter or stuff like that, and how do we kind of make it, how do we inject it into the rest of the movie and kind of make that an experience throughout, the entire 84 minutes or whatever.
Yeah, I think exemplified too in this like balance of artifice and reality, in that I'm forgetting the character's name, but the woman who's on her
Barbara,
own,
yes,
Barbara,
yeah.
her performance in the acting class is so revealing, but it's this construct. Yeah, it's very beautiful. We have a couple questions from the audience. I want to make sure we can get to them. And this relates to like the specific characters. Stunned. This is from Sarah. She asks, stunned by the access you achieved with these folks. Was it difficult to find people to participate? And then I guess on top of that, I'd love to ask, how did you sort of hone in on these subjects?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think, yes, it's always hard. It's never easy. I think it's not easy to convince someone if you were to say, hey, I'm going to, stick a camera in front of your face and, can you let me follow you around for the next 3 years while you go through like the worst moments of your life? It's definitely not, for one, you don't really approach someone like that. So I guess, that was different. But I do think like, in Barbara's case, and then also I can kind of go into how, every case was different. But for Barbara, I think we had found, I met her around a time. I met her actually at the acting club, like my first night in the Villages. I introduced myself to everybody. I gave my whole spiel. I didn't know what I was doing there. Please tell me your experiences, help me out. And she immediately kind of came up to me. She was like, after the class ended, she was one of the few people who wasn't participating. And she, she kind of told me everything that was going on in her life, that her husband was dying, that she didn't want to be there. She wanted to be in Boston. She couldn't afford it. And, a lot of the stuff that was going on in her life, I was just kind of stunned by how transparent she was and how expressive she was, and how, she totally wanted to be involved in this film. I think maybe part of it came from a place of not having a lot of people in the community that she could speak with. And I think maybe part of it was like, at least on, my appearance, I wasn't like I wasn't like a 55-year-old filmmaker or something. Maybe there was a part of that as well. But I think that was certainly part of it. And then I think for Reggie and Anne and Dennis, I think a lot of it, Dennis, I think was probably similar to Dennis and Reggie. I think were similar to Barbara in that way, where they had these stories they wanted to tell. I was lucky enough and fortunate enough that they entrusted me with telling their stories. And, they trusted me like I, trusted them. But they were, I think they were sort of natural performers in a way, and they were very theatrical, and they enjoyed being in front of the camera. Anne was probably the only one who was not like sold on the experience at first. And I think for very good reason. When I first met her, I had just come off filming with Reggie at the pool when he was doing the lightning dance and the drugs and all that stuff. And the first time I met him, he had given my crew and I like a loaf of bread, which we later learned after consuming was like doused in THC, and we ended up getting really stoned unintentionally with him. And the next day I meet Anne, and I was like, oh my god, you didn't tell me you have a wife? Like, what? And then I think Anne was like, who are these people? What's going on here? But it took time. It took a lot of time. It took, I think with Anne, it was really, I think the way we had to shoot the film, I think also probably allowed us to gain as much trust as we did. This wasn't a film where we were kind of like flies on the wall, shooting verite all the time. Like, because we're shooting on one camera with a tripod, we had to be extremely honest, essentially, every time we wanted to shoot something. I had to kind of explain what I was trying to shoot, why I was trying to shoot it, how it was probably going to play into the film a little bit. And then from there, it was kind of like we were working together to tell something that was happening in their lives. Like this wasn't scripted, but it was definitely, you know, I'd interview a subject. I'd interview Anne, for example. She would tell me something, a story, an anecdote, and I would kind of work with her to film what that is, and then try and make it feel as real as possible to what her experience was. So I think there was a part of that allowed, you know, I was kind of putting myself on the line by, you know, I was just adamant that I didn't want to make this film as something where I would just kind of shoot a bunch of stuff and, you know, the subjects wouldn't know what I was shooting, and I would just go and find a story out of it in the edit. It was more of like, I wanted to kind of implant myself in their lives, you know, make this film together and kind of work with them as if I was, you know, like a kind of a collaborator in telling their stories and bearing witness to their stories. So I think it takes time is the short answer, but I think there's a lot of stuff that had to happen. And I think with someone like Anne, who, you know, I think for very good reason, again, was probably wary at first of like having a random person come into her life and basically film her relationship almost fall apart. It took a lot of trust, and it took a lot of conversations. It took a lot of dinners. It took a lot of time where we were able to just sync up, and, you know, we were basically living like 3 doors down from them while we were shooting this film in our own house, like our crew was. So it was a very, and even to this day, like I talk with each of them even before the movie, you know, was slated to come out. Like we talk like, you know, once or twice a week. So it's like, it's a relationship that I think has become even, you know, while we were filming and even after we ended up finishing filming, like I felt personally probably more close with them than I do with like certain members of my family or certain people in my own life. Like I had to get there myself if they were going to kind of get there with me, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. It also, specifically with Reggie and the camera almost feels like it's therapeutic. The presence of the camera. Maybe that's a construct that you've put in there, but it almost seems like your presence is allowing them to like reflect. Specifically, Reggie towards the end of the film, it feels that way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say I'm like the, you know, like the love doctor or something. Because I definitely, if I was, it would be great. I would love to use it in my own life, but I'm not. I think like, you know, I think there's something interesting about putting two people kind of in a frame together who don't normally speak all so much, and then kind of just asking, you know, general questions, then more specific ones, and sometimes tougher ones. I think like, you know, the interview frames that, you know, we interviewed them twice. You see it earlier in the film when Reggie's a little bit more unstable, and then towards the end after his like court appearance and everything, and he's really trying to save the relationship. I think like in their case, they just hadn't really, you know, before we got there, they just were living on these completely different schedules and cycles. You know, Reggie was doing his own thing with all of his like Eastern spirituality stuff, and then Anne was just kind of going and playing pickleball, and Reggie was more nocturnal, and Anne was kind of just like living a pretty normal existence. And even though they had been together for so long, like 42 years, their relationship became something, it's seemingly more of like a matters of convenience. Like Reggie says in the film that they were roommates and didn't have a real marriage. And then finally, you know, I think when I interviewed them, I think it brought out something in both of them that I don't know if either of them had sort of expected to have happened. So there definitely was something going on in the room. Maybe I hope for them it was therapeutic. I mean, you know, right now they're still together, and, you know, Reggie's sought help and he's seeing a psychiatrist, and he's kind of doing the work he needs to do to, you know, to remain like, you know, just to upkeep his own mental health. But it does seem like I don't know if it's a byproduct of being in this film and having seen the film many times, but I think there was something that had happened with all of us that we had kind of collectively experienced, that I'm very grateful to them for obviously appearing in the film, but also like allowing me in their life the way they did.
We have another. This is a more specific question about Dennis. This is a question from Tim. Did you find it hard to remain neutral with the film's subjects? At any point did you want to step in and warn the woman to stay away from Dennis when he comes sort of
It's a
knock?
good question. I mean, yeah, no, totally. I think, and in some cases we did. I think in some cases, there's two women. One of them, who's at the bowling alley with Dennis. She knew him pretty well already, and I think was just sort of like she considered him a friend. And he always would kind of do this thing where they'd go bowling, get a drink, and she kind of knew what to expect. So there was always sort of a moment before we would start filming where I would just kind of have a moment alone with whoever we were with. That Dennis would be kind of afar, and my DP would be talking to him about something, and I'd be like, do you know who he is? Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
I think the worst thing that could have happened in my mind, like the worst case scenario that I was desperately trying to avoid, was like I didn't want anyone to ever feel like pressured to have to say yes to someone because there was a camera from afar on them. So, Nancy, the woman that Dennis was dating, they had been together before, and it seemed like she knew exactly who he was and what he was doing. The one woman who I feel like didn't really know him that well there's a woman in the red. She's wearing red at the pool, and she was someone I was basically like, okay, well, he like I was like, honestly, this is kind of, he has a little bit of a reputation. You should feel free, if you would never like normally respond to this kind of person and these kinds of requests, like feel free to respond as naturally and normally as you possibly can. And then, we shot that scene, and then when he's like, can I stay at your house? And she's like, no, like definitely not. I was happy that happened, but there were other moments. I think, look, like Dennis is a conflicted fellow, and I don't think he's conflicted in actually any of his own decisions in life. But I think as like a outside observer, it's probably very easy, to disagree with the way he lives his life. And I think that was something, an urge that I was always kind of trying to fight against. Like, I think, I think this just kind of goes back to like the general tenant in some way of making the movie, was that like when I look at Dennis, I don't see him as like an old person. I see him as a person who just like makes, I think, like to be kind of completely I don't know, I feel like Dennis, and I feel like the elderly more generally, when you see films about the elderly, they seek to defang them, and they kind of seek to kind of make their adventures seem a little bit pacifying or something. When I think of a movie, no shade to this movie, I'm sure many people like it. When I think of a movie like Palms, I think of something that's a lot more of a PG kind of rated existence. And I think Dennis is someone who's able to kind of use his appearance as a way to bamboozle people, and he's kind of a trickster, and like in a kind of ancient kind of fashion. Like the way he operates his life is in a completely different. He almost is like a character in a novel or something. So definitely, there were moments where he was talking about how he was, planning on committing suicide and stuff like that, and after he would say stuff like that, and we would, I'd finish, we'd call, I would stop filming. I'd be like, are you, actually serious about that? And we would talk about it. And it became pretty clear to me that was, maybe it was like 30% seriousness, and the rest of it was just sort of a tactic to get people to like give him money and stuff like that. But there was always considerations. Like, I think that was the thing of making the movie, is that you can't really divorce, like, when the lives of your subjects get worse. I think there's a tension, obviously, and that, dramatically it may be better for your film, but obviously I think you still have a responsibility to, intervene somewhat if you really think things are getting bad, So there's always that kind of tension that we had to kind of walk through while making the film.
Yeah. Did you learn of him but through reputation, or how did you come in contact with him specifically?
No, I mean, crazily, it seemed like most people, like, now that the film's coming out, I'm starting to see some people in the villages comment like, that guy was kicked out of my pool. So I'm just like, oh, wow. I first met him. He was masquerade. He was like a wolf in sheep's clothes. I went to a villages singles event through a different subject in the film, who's in the beginning, but we filmed a lot with her, and we didn't end up, including a lot of her story in the film. She ran a villages singles club, and he was there. He was kind of masquerading as a villages resident, there to presumably pick up someone. He gave me a business card, because that's sort of like the social currency that a lot of people, it's like their version of Facebook in a way. Obviously, several villagers use Facebook, but like, it's an old fashioned Facebook. On the business card is like who you are, your relationship status, like your interests. And his card said celebrity handyman and personal companion for hire. So I was like, is this guy joking? I kind of thought he was maybe some sort of gigolo or something. I think he had been living with someone the first time I had met him. And it was only until like a year after I ran into him again and I saw that he was like in a van outside of Panera Bread. And I was like, what the hell is this? And he's like, oh, this is where I live. And then I was like, oh, wow. And then, you know, everything kind of went along from there. But he's a funny guy. You know, I think his objective in life, honestly, I think now is to like get the Farley brothers back together to make a movie about his life. Because I think he loved the movie Green Book so much, which is like, you know, he's got to get better movie taste, I think. No offense. But anyway, you know, I think it's interesting. It's interesting that he kind of has this desire to have his story told for some reason. I'm not sure why.
Yeah. We have just a couple more from the audience. And this kind of relates to this singles club operator that you mentioned. Sarah asks, how are these stories chosen, which we kind of went over? Did you start with more story threads and then narrow them down? Or was it like a wider array of characters and then you kind of honed in on these three? And then how did you land on just these three?
Yeah.
Story threads.
I think, you know, so we started off with a number of people, like 12 to 15 maybe. And I think there wasn't a whole lot of logic when we first started. I think it was really just who seemingly, you know, had a role in the community, who could kind of introduce us to other people. And it was kind of like, at first it was just sort of like, let's just start making inroads and start seeing people who have these interesting interests. I definitely knew I wanted to follow some people who kind of were the more archetypal villagers whose experiences, you know, to me were they derived a lot of fulfillment from the clubs they belonged to, and the way they spent their time was sort of exactly how the Village's brochure kind of advertised it to be. Mm-hmm. And then I think, you know, after we spent time with those people, I knew, you know, the feeling that I was chasing was this feeling of, you know, what happens when you kind of exist outside of the brochure, and what happens when you're kind of, you know, the dream, so to speak, has turned into a nightmare in a way. And it wasn't like I was like, I don't think I was like looking only with that lens. But when I met Reggie, I didn't realize that he had been married. I didn't realize that his relationship was with someone who was so, you know, who had interests that were the polar opposites of his. I think ultimately what ended up being like the guiding, you know, thing that we just kept going closer and closer to is this idea of, you know, trying to telling the stories of these people who could kind of, you know, while they aren't the mainstream of the place, they being the fact that they were kind of on the borders of everything, I thought that they could kind of offer an interesting lens into, you know, how the rest of the community worked. And when you kind of bounce between the scenes of, you know, their stories, and then you bounce between those with the stories of, you know, or just the scenes of clubs and organized activities and everything, I thought it could kind of hopefully offer a kind of different perspective on why people choose to engage in those activities. I think in some ways, you know, for a lot of people, the distraction of being a part of something larger than you that makes you and forces you out of bed every day, is, you know, an effective way to kind of live the rest of, you know, the end of your life. So I wanted to tell stories of people who didn't belong to that. And, you know, hopefully, again, they would kind of, the realness and the rawness of the things they were going through would kind of lend a, you know, crack through the varnish of the place and kind of give it a, you know, make it feel, you know, yeah, kind of embracing the artifice of the place to get to something realer, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. A question about the aspect ratio, why 1:3:7:1? Did you know that going in? It works beautifully with the like clean line.
Thank you. That's because I'm a hipster, man. No, I'm just no. I think there's a few things. You know, for one, I didn't know that I wanted to make this movie that way, and you know, I think we were testing things out and we were shooting things, and I think, you know, the first thing is I wanted to make it kind of feel a little bit claustrophobic at the very least, or just kind of be able to get to settings, get to places where I only had like, 10 minutes or less than that to kind of set up a shot, usually like far less than that. And I wanted to kind of be able to know that I would be able to crop out all the shit and the sides of the frame and just make something that felt extremely intentional. And then I think the other part of this too, I think like there was we were watching a lot of like the movies that were kind of on the Village's central kind of TV things. And there was a sort of like Turner Classic movie kind of vibe to me about that ratio of trying to do something that felt like it was harking back to something older, but also, we were shooting it digitally, obviously. And, there was kind of one step in the past and, another step in the future in a way. And something about it that was interesting. But I think a lot of it really just kind of came back. That's like me over intellectualizing it. It really came back to, I think, a process point. And then also just, being able to create these frames where, when we were following a subject, they could be the center of it, but it felt like a very subjective kind of much more claustrophobic experience where there was, we were capturing like the grandeur of a world. We were setting up these shots that felt like these big wide tableaus, but like, I think the combination of shooting in that ratio plus just sort of the way we were cutting, which is pretty fast, kind of created this sort of uncanny thing. So I think there was a few things, but I would say the most honestly came from process, and then the other kind of came from like a romantic kind of place. Yeah.
Great. Last question before you go. I want to ask about that final shot that of Barbara dancing. Did you realize in the moment that that was going to be the end of the film? It's such like a poignant, perfect end point.
No, I mean, well, it's funny. I think my cinematographer, David Bolin, I've been working with him for like most of my life. Honestly, he's one of my best friends. And he's, like the editor of the who I cut the movie with, Daniel Garber. He's like, I feel like they both are, co-authors of this movie along with me. I remember when we got the, when we were pulling out of the servo zoom, I remember I just was like, oh, it felt so good. And then I went to David and he was like, that's the last shot. And I didn't know it at the moment, but I think it became pretty clear to me and Daniel when we were editing that, I don't know, there was something kind of bittersweet about it. I think for one, it was Barbara being able to find solace in being alone. And then I think another part of it too was sort of this idea that like, the individual who we've been following around kind of alone for most of the film is kind of now joining the flock and is becoming kind of like just another person in a sea of people who are doing something, doing something to kind of distract themselves. So I think there is an interesting element of like, you could read it as hopeful, you could read it as just depressing, but I think it's just human nature to kind of find solace in like, just distracting yourself to death. Honestly, I think that's what we do all the time when we're bored, and, the way we use our computers and live our lives in a deeply technological world. It's like all we do. I think we all have different versions of like a Village's like experience, without really having to leave our bedroom at this point, just because everything's so siloed and crazy when you're too online. But anyway, I appreciate you having me, and thank you for the excellent questions, both Sam and the audience. Thank you for tuning in.
We have an astute base of cinephile members who ask great questions. Thank you, Lance, for being here and for sharing the film. It's a timely piece of work, I think, and congratulations on all its success.
Thank you.
It's available everywhere starting, I believe, January 15th.
Yes. Well, and it's available in theaters crazily on Friday. So if you are in Florida, in Florida theaters on Friday. So if you are in Florida and you feel safe and you want to go about it that way, by all means. If you want to stay safe and stay home, which I also totally understand, everywhere on the 15th.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in, and thanks, Lance, for being here.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Sam.
Yep.
Take care.
You too.